The dress was the color of ripe wheat. Emma had spent 3 weeks sewing it in secret, stealing moments between her duties in the castle kitchens, hiding the fabric beneath her straw mattress as though it were a piece of treasure she had no right to own. And in its own way, it was. Every stitch had been sewn with a needle borrowed from old Marta, seamstress to the ladies' chambers, who had closed her eyes to the small theft of time and linen thread without saying a word. The result was far from perfect. The hem ran slightly crooked on the left side, and the sleeves were not quite even. But when Emma slipped it on that evening and studied her reflection in the polished surface of the copper washing basin, she felt, for the first time in more years than she could count, that she looked like someone who belonged to something larger than herself. The grand gathering of the packs took place once a year at Dawnhollow Castle, when the lords of the neighboring packs brought their sons, their daughters, and their promises to the court of the Lycan king. It was a night of negotiations, of sealed bonds, and of declarations spoken aloud before witnesses who would remember them. For the nobility, it was politics dressed in velvet. For the servants, it was a dream they were not supposed to have. For Emma, on this particular night, it was the fulfillment of a promise she had been carrying inside her chest for 2 full winters, turning it over in her hands like a smooth stone, checking every morning that it was still there. Gareth, son of the Lord of the Ashvale Pack, had promised to choose her. It had not been a grand declaration delivered in front of a crowd. It had been whispered on a quiet autumn afternoon, when he had found her alone in the castle's herb garden, with her hands deep in the soil, and a bundle of fresh thyme resting across her knees. "You are not like the others," he had told her, in a low voice that she had felt more than heard. "At the grand gathering, I will stand before everyone and declare myself. I will choose you." She had looked at him for a long, careful moment, the way she always looked at things that seemed too good to be true, weighing the risk of believing against the cost of being wrong. Then he had reached out and taken her hand, dirty with garden earth and all, and pressed his lips softly to her knuckles. She had chosen to believe him. 2 winters of believing. 2 winters of waking before dawn to haul water and stoke fires and peel vegetables in the cold kitchen, carrying that promise like a lantern through all of it. 2 winters of smiling quietly when their paths crossed in the castle corridors, of saying nothing to anyone except Sina, of guarding the secret carefully, because she understood, even then, that the world did not tend to be generous with Omega servants who reached for things beyond their station. And that evening, as she descended the long stone staircase toward the great hall, with the wheat-colored dress pressed smooth, and a single blue ribbon braided carefully into her blonde hair, Emma allowed herself, for just a few minutes, to stop being afraid that she was wrong. The great hall had been entirely transformed. Resin torches burned at steady intervals along the ancient stone walls, throwing warm golden light across the pack banners hanging from the high raftered ceiling. Red and silver for the Ashvale Pack, deep forest green and gold for the Northern Pines Pack, black and amber for the Split Rock Pack, and a dozen others besides, representing every major pack that had answered the Lycan King's annual summons. The long oak tables were heavy with food, pitchers of dark red wine, whole roasted joints of meat still glistening, round loaves of bread fresh enough to still be steaming at the centers, bowls of stewed root vegetables, platters of roasted chestnuts. Candles burned in iron holders between the dishes, adding their thin smoke to the heavier scent already filling the hall. That scent was the one Emma had grown up breathing, the particular smell of a gathering of wolves. Earth and pine resin and leather and something underneath all of it, something older and wilder that had no clean name, the smell that soaked into stone walls over decades and never entirely left. She had always found it grounding rather than threatening. Tonight it made her feel almost brave. She found Sina waiting near the wide column closest to the hall's entrance, exactly where they had agreed to meet. Sina had been her closest friend since the 2 of them had arrived at Dawnhollow as young girls, sent together from the same small village to serve in the kitchens. Now at 23, Sina wore her dark hair cut short and close to her jaw, and she had a clear-eyed, unhurried way of seeing the world that Emma had relied on more times than she could count. "You look beautiful," Sina said. But there was something in the way she said it. A smallness. A breath held one beat too long. "What is it?" Emma asked. Sina opened her mouth, looked past Emma's shoulder toward the far side of the hall, closed her mouth again. "Nothing. Go on. He will be looking for you." Emma studied her friend's face for one more second, then turned and followed her gaze across the hall. She found Gareth without difficulty. He was standing near the fireplace on the far wall, his back half turned to her, deep in conversation with his father. Lord Edric of Ashvale was a broad man with heavy shoulders and the kind of permanently closed expression that suggested he had long ago decided the world owed him more than it gave. Emma had never liked him. She began making her way across the hall, stepping carefully around servants carrying laden trays and clusters of nobles who stood talking in their fine cloaks, keeping her chin level and her pace steady. She was fewer than 10 paces away when Gareth turned. For one single moment, his eyes found hers through the movement of the crowd. Emma saw the recognition in them. She saw something else beneath it, something she did not name, because naming it would have required admitting what it meant, and she was not ready to do that yet. Then, Lord Edric leaned close to his son's ear and said something low, and Gareth looked away. When Emma drew close enough to be clearly visible, Gareth took one step to his left. Just one step, unhurried and deliberate. And that single step revealed what had been partially hidden behind him. A young woman standing at his side. Isolde, daughter of the Lord of the Northern Pines Pack. Dark hair pinned with silver combs, a gown of deep burgundy velvet with gold stitching at the cuffs, a necklace of pale stones at her throat. An alpha woman of old and unimpeachable lineage, chosen by a family that knew exactly what it was doing. "Gareth," Emma said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. He looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before. It was not cruelty. Cruelty would have been something she could have hardened herself against. It was discomfort. The particular discomfort of a man who had made a promise casually, in an autumn garden, and had now arrived at the moment when it must be answered for. "Emma," he said quietly, "this is not the time." "You gave me your word," she replied, still quiet, still steady. Her hands pressed flat against the skirt of the wheat-colored dress. Lord Edric looked at her then. A single, unhurried sweep of his gaze from her ribbon-braided hair to the slightly uneven hem of her dress. Then he turned his eyes elsewhere, as though the survey had confirmed something he already knew and required no further attention. "My son has made a decision appropriate to our pack's standing," Lord Edric said, directing his words at the middle distance rather than at Emma. "Lady Isolde represents a union that strengthens Ashvale. I am certain a sensible girl understands what that means." Emma understood exactly what it meant, because in that same moment, Gareth turned to Isolde and offered her his arm. And he was smiling. The same quiet, easy smile that Emma had believed, in a garden full of thyme and late afternoon light, had been meant for her alone. And then, before the watching eyes of every lord and noble gathered in the great hall of Dawnhollow Castle, he walked Isolde to the center of the floor, where the declaring pairs would stand for the rest of the evening. The declaration had been made, simply not the one Emma had been promised. She stood completely still for 3 full breaths. The hall went on around her. Voices, laughter, the rhythmic sound of pitchers meeting oak, boots crossing stone floors. No one looked at her. No one needed to. She was a servant Omega who had made the mistake of expecting something she had no claim to, and the mistake had been corrected. That was the entirety of what had happened, from where they all stood. Emma did not cry. Something at the center of her chest, something small and dense and surprisingly hard, refused to allow it. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit. Each step was deliberate and even. She did not hurry. She did not look back at Gareth, at Isolde, at any of it. She kept her shoulders straight and her chin parallel to the stone floor, even as she felt the 3 weeks of borrowed needle and stolen hours and 2 winters of a carefully held promise come apart somewhere behind her sternum, quietly and completely, like a seam that had never been quite strong enough to hold. She was 6 steps from the door when she walked directly into someone. The impact was solid and immediate, like stepping into warm stone that did not move. Emma took 1 sharp step back and looked up. The man before her was tall enough that she had to tilt her head to properly see his face. Black hair braided in long, heavy rows fell past his shoulders onto a mantle of dark fur. Leather armor with wide straps crossed at his chest. Dark bracers buckled at both wrists, and at his hip, the hilt of a sword that carried the worn, honest look of something used in earnest rather than for ceremony. A pale scar traced a thin line across his jaw, and his eyes, a blue so deep and steady it felt less like a color and more like a held decision, were looking directly at her. Not past her, not through her, at her. It was not pity. Emma knew pity intimately and would have recognized it in a heartbeat. She would have stepped around it without slowing. This was something else entirely. The particular attention of someone who had seen something unexpected and was taking the necessary time to understand what it was. 2 men flanked him. The one to his right had chestnut hair and a half smile that suggested he found most situations mildly entertaining, and was simply waiting to see which category this one would fall into. The one to his left was younger, arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone practicing boredom as a discipline, though his eyes moved steadily across the room with a quiet, practiced vigilance that had nothing bored about it at all. The man with the braided black hair did not step aside. He did not speak. He looked at Emma with the same unhurried, measuring attention, as though he had nowhere more important to be, and no interest in pretending otherwise. Then from the herald's post near the great doors came a voice that cut cleanly across every conversation in the hall. His Royal Highness, Prince Tristan, heir to Lycan King Aldrich, Lord of the Northern Pax. The silence that followed was the kind that falls when an entire room of wolves becomes collectively still. Emma looked at the man in front of her, at the blue eyes that had not moved from her face through any of it. She had just walked into the Lycan Prince in the doorway of the hall, where she had spent 2 winters hoping to be chosen, and had been turned away in front of everyone. The man with chestnut hair tilted his head slightly, glanced between the 2 of them, and allowed his half-smile to settle into something more deliberate. "Well," he said, to no one in particular. The evening just became something else entirely. Tristan had not intended to arrive at the grand gathering at all. He had ridden through the night from the eastern border, where 3 days of territorial disputes between 2 minor packs had required his presence and his patience in roughly equal and exhausting measure. He had planned to send his cousin Brennan in his place. Brennan, who stood now at his right with that insufferable half-smile, and who genuinely enjoyed these evenings in a way Tristan had never been able to replicate. But his father had sent a rider to the border camp with a message that contained only 8 words, and those 8 words had been enough. Your presence at Dawn Hollow is not a request. So he had come. He had ridden hard, arrived late, and walked through the great doors of the hall with road dust still on his boots, and the particular weariness of a man who has been managing other people's problems for 3 days without adequate sleep. He had not come to observe the declarations. He had not come to be announced. He had come because Lycan King Aldrich had summoned him, and because in 29 years of living, Tristan had learned that ignoring his father's summons cost considerably more than obeying them. He had not expected the woman. She had been moving toward the exit with the controlled precision of someone exercising enormous effort to appear unhurried, and she had walked into him without seeing him at all, which told him, more clearly than anything else could have, exactly where her attention had been. He had steadied her by instinct, one hand briefly at her arm, and in that single moment of contact, he had caught her scent. It stopped him completely. Not the way a scent sometimes caught attention. A passing note, pleasant or otherwise, quickly filed and forgotten. This was different. This moved through him the way cold water moves through a crack in stone, finding every space, filling it. It was layered in a way that made no sense for an Omega servant in a wheat-colored dress with a crooked hem, warm amber and something green and living, like a forest after rain. Underneath it a thread of something ancient that he could not name and could not ignore. He had been trained since boyhood to read the scents of other wolves. His father had drilled it into him alongside swordsmanship and treaty law and the management of pack borders. A wolf's scent tells you everything they will not, the old king used to say. Learn to listen with your nose before you open your mouth. Tristan had taken the lesson seriously. He had learned to distinguish fear from anger, genuine calm from performed calm, health from sickness, strength from its counterfeit. What he was reading from the woman in front of him had no category he recognized. "You are bleeding," said Cade, his younger brother, from his left. Cade was 24 and had the unsettling habit of stating plainly what everyone else was working around. Tristan looked down. The woman had pressed her hand against the door frame when she stepped back from the collision, and a small cut on her palm, old, not from the impact, had reopened against the stone. A thin line of red crossed her hand. She looked at it with the expression of someone who has encountered one inconvenience too many in a single evening and has simply run out of the energy required to react. "It is nothing," she said. Her voice was quiet and even. She began to pull her hand back. "It is not nothing," Brennan said cheerfully from Tristan's right. "Stone floors in this castle are filthy. I would know. I spent a winter here when I was 12 and nearly lost a toe to an infected splinter." The woman looked at Brennan with the particular expression of someone who does not know whether they are being mocked and is too tired to determine which it is. Tristan reached into the leather satchel at his hip, the one that contained, among other things, a traveling kit his mother had insisted on, since he was old enough to ride alone, and produced a strip of clean linen. He held it out toward her. She did not take it immediately. She looked at it, then at him, with eyes the color of winter sky, pale gray-blue, careful and currently carrying the particular wariness of someone who has just learned an expensive lesson about accepting things that are offered. "I am not going to pretend the evening has been kind to you," Tristan said. He kept his voice low enough that it did not carry beyond the three of them. "But the cut should be wrapped. Take it." Something shifted slightly in her expression. Not softening exactly, more like a reassessment. She took the linen and wrapped it around her palm herself, neatly and without ceremony, the way someone accustomed to managing small injuries alone would do it. When she finished, she looked up at him. "Thank you, Your Highness," she said. Steady, no trace of performance in it. "Tristan," he said. She blinked. "I have been called Your Highness by people in this hall who would not recognize me in a market square," he said. "You walked into me. You can use my name." Brennan made a small sound at his right that was almost certainly suppressed laughter. Tristan did not look at him. The woman held his gaze for a moment. Then, with the air of someone accepting a strange but harmless arrangement, "Emma," she said. From across the hall came the sound of music beginning, a low ceremonial string arrangement that signaled the formal start of the declaration proceedings. Tristan glanced toward the center of the floor, where pairs were beginning to assemble. He saw the young Lord of Ashval standing with a dark-haired woman in burgundy velvet, and he saw, in the same glance, the way Emma's eyes moved briefly and involuntarily in the same direction before she pulled them back. She had controlled her face well, but not quite fast enough. "Come away from the doorway," Tristan said. It was not a command, precisely. It was the tone of someone making a practical suggestion. "I was leaving," Emma said. "I know. But you are standing half in and half out, and everyone who passes will see exactly what they think they understand about this moment." He paused. "Unless that is what you prefer." She considered that for exactly 2 seconds. Then she stepped away from the door and moved to stand near the column at the edge of the hall, in the shadow between 2 torch brackets, where the light was softer and the view of the center floor was partially obscured. Tristan followed, with Brennan and Cade falling into position a few paces behind in the unspoken way they always managed without being directed. "You did not need to do that," Emma said. She was looking at the column rather than at him. "Do what?" "Give me a reason to step away that did not sound like charity." Tristan looked at her profile, the straight line of her nose, the ribbon still braided into her hair, slightly loosened now from the evening. The way she held herself, spine straight, hands quiet at her sides, carrying something heavy without letting it show in her posture. "It was not charity," he said. "It was accurate." She glanced at him then. A sideways look, brief and evaluating. "You just arrived," she said. It was not a question. She had noted the road dust, the weariness, the boots. "An hour ago. And you already know what happened." "I know enough," he said. "I know what a declaration ceremony looks like when it has gone wrong for someone, and I know what it looks like when that someone has decided not to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing it on their face." Emma was quiet for a moment. The music from the center of the hall moved through the stone columns around them, low and formal. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked. Her voice was not hostile. It was genuine. The question of someone who has been taught by experience to look for the cost in unexpected kindness. It was a fair question. Tristan had been asking himself a version of it since the moment she walked into him, since the moment her scent had moved through him like a key turning in a lock he had not known was there. He did not have a clean answer, so he gave her the truest one he had. "I do not know yet," he said. She looked at him fully then, for the first time since they had stepped away from the door. The pale gray-blue eyes were direct and unguarded in a way that struck him as rare, not naive, but honest. The look of someone who had stopped seeing the point of pretending. Before either of them could say anything further, a voice cut across the hall. Loud, carrying, with the particular edge of someone who wanted to be heard by more than just his intended audience. "I see the prince has found himself an Omega stray to occupy his evening." Gareth of Ashvale stood 10 paces away, Isolde still at his arm, a cup of wine in his free hand, and an expression on his face that sat exactly between amusement and contempt. Several of the nobles nearby had turned to look. Lord Edric, just behind his son, wore the small, satisfied expression of a man whose evening was going precisely as planned. Emma went completely still. Tristan turned his head and looked at Gareth of Ashvale for the first time that evening. He did not say anything. He simply looked. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It was the kind of silence that has weight. Gareth's smile held for 2 of those seconds. Then it did something complicated. Then he turned back to Isolde and said something low, and took a long drink from his cup, and did not look in Tristan's direction again. Brennan leaned close to Tristan's ear. "You did not even speak," he murmured, with quiet appreciation. "That was masterful." Tristan did not respond to Brennan. He turned back to Emma. She was still looking at the space where Gareth had been. Her jaw was set. Her hands were at her sides and perfectly still. But he could see, very faintly, the tendons in her wrapped hand pressing against the linen. "Emma," he said quietly. She turned to look at him. Her eyes were dry. Whatever she was carrying it alone, and had clearly been doing so for long enough that she had become efficient at it. "I would like to know," he said, keeping his voice low, "what it is about you that made a man like that think he could afford to let you go." She stared at him. "That is a strange thing to say to someone you met 4 minutes ago," she said at last. "Perhaps," Tristan said, "but I have been standing in this hall for less than an hour, and I have already found it more interesting than I expected. That is entirely your doing." For the first time that evening, something moved across Emma's face that was not pain, not wariness, and not the careful, controlled stillness she had been maintaining since the moment he first saw her. It was not quite a smile, but it was close enough to change everything about her expression. Cade, from 3 paces behind, uncrossed his arms for the first time all evening. The morning after the grand gathering arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that made the castle feel older than it was, the stone walls pulling the night's chill into themselves and holding it long after the sun had climbed above the tree line. Emma was in the kitchen by the time the first light came through the narrow window slits, her hands already in flour, her hair pulled back under a linen cloth, the blue ribbon from the night before folded carefully at the bottom of her mattress, where she would not have to look at it. Sina worked beside her in silence for a long while, which was how Emma knew that Sina understood the exact shape of what had happened, and had decided that words, at least for now, would not improve it. It was Sina who finally spoke. "The prince's men are still here," she said, without looking up from the dough she was working. "I heard the stable hands talking this morning. His horses haven't been brought out." "He arrived late," Emma said. "He likely needs the rest." Sina pressed her knuckles into the dough. "And is that why you have kneaded that same portion of bread 4 times without noticing?" Emma looked down at her hands. She had, in fact, worked the same section of dough past any reasonable point of usefulness. She moved her hands to a fresh portion and said nothing. The truth was that she had not slept well. Not because of Gareth. That wound had closed already into something flat and final, the way wounds sometimes did when they were clean enough. What had kept her turning on the narrow cot was something harder to name. A blue gaze that did not look away. A strip of linen offered without performance. "I do not know yet." 4 words that should have meant nothing from a man she had met in a doorway and would almost certainly never speak to again. She told herself that firmly as she shaped the loaves and slid them toward the fire. By mid-morning, the castle had shifted into the particular organized motion that followed any large gathering. Lords departing, servants clearing, the great hall being stripped of its banners and scrubbed down to bare stone. Emma carried linens, hauled water, and kept her eyes on her work with the practiced focus of someone who had long ago learned that invisibility was its own form of safety. She was crossing the inner courtyard with a basket of folded tablecloths when she heard his voice, not directed at her. He was speaking to an older man near the stables, one of his father's advisors, by the look of the gray robes and the long-suffering expression. Tristan stood with his back partially to her, still in the leather armor from the night before, one hand resting on the pommel of his sword in the absent way of someone who had worn weapons long enough that they became furniture. He was listening more than speaking, which Emma noted was consistent with everything she had observed the previous evening. She would have walked past. She had every intention of walking past. He turned his head as she crossed the courtyard, and their eyes met across 30 feet of cold morning air. He said something brief to the advisor, who nodded and moved away. Then Tristan crossed the courtyard toward her with the unhurried, ground-covering stride of someone accustomed to covering distances without appearing to rush. Emma adjusted the basket on her hip and waited. Running would have been undignified, and she had used up her dignity quota for the week simply getting through the previous evening. "You work early," he said, when he reached her. "The bread does not wait for sleep, your high—" She stopped, looked at him. Tristan. Something in his expression acknowledged that without making it into more than it was. "How is the hand?" he asked. She had forgotten about the cut. She glanced down at her right palm, where the strip of his linen was still wrapped, slightly grubby now from a morning of kitchen work. "Better," she said. "Thank you for the bandage. I will return the linen when I have washed it." "Keep it," he said. "It is good linen." "I have more linen than I have any reasonable use for," he said. "One strip will not be missed." Emma looked at him for a moment. In the gray morning light, with no torchlight and no ceremony, he looked different from the night before. Not less, but differently. The road weariness was still there around his eyes. The scar along his jaw caught the flat daylight more clearly. He looked like a man who did a great deal of difficult work and had long ago stopped expecting acknowledgement for it. "Why are you still here?" she asked. The question came out more directly than she intended, but she did not take it back. "My father wanted to speak with me this morning," he said. "The meeting ran long. A beat. And I wanted to see how you were." Emma regarded him steadily. "You do not know me," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I know what I saw last night, and I know what I smelled, and those two things together are not something I am inclined to walk away from without at least asking the question." "What question?" He looked at her with those steady blue eyes and said plainly, "Who are you, Emma? Not what you are, not what position you hold in this castle. Who are you?" No one had asked her that. Not in those words, in that order, with that particular quality of genuine wanting to know. The lords and their sons who occasionally noticed her existence asked what she could do, or what she was, or, as Gareth had framed it, how she was different from the others, which turned out to mean not different enough to matter when the stakes were real. She opened her mouth, closed it. "I am not sure anyone has ever asked me that," she said at last. "Then, you have been surrounded by people who were not paying attention," Tristan said. Before Emma could respond, footsteps rang across the courtyard stones, and Brennan appeared from the direction of the great hall, cloak thrown over one shoulder, looking unreasonably cheerful for the hour. "There you are," he said to Tristan. "Your father's steward has been looking for you for the last quarter hour. Something about the Split Rock border agreement needing your signature before Lord Fenwick departs." He glanced at Emma with the half-smile that seemed to be his default expression. "Good morning. You look considerably better than last night, which is entirely to your credit given the circumstances." "Brennan," Tristan said, without inflection. "I'm being complimentary," Brennan said, mildly offended. "You are being Brennan, which is not always the same thing." Emma found, to her own surprise, that something almost like a laugh moved through her chest at that. She pressed it down, but not before Tristan caught it. His eyes moved briefly to her face with an expression she was starting to recognize. That quiet, noting attention, as though small things mattered to him in proportion to how much they revealed. "I have to go," he said to her. "My father's signature requirements do not negotiate." "Of course," Emma said, shifting the basket back to both hands. "I should finish my rounds," he nodded, turned to follow Brennan, then stopped. "Emma," he said, without turning fully back. "Yes?" "The Ashvale lord and his son depart this afternoon." She understood what he was telling her. She would not have to watch Gareth walk through these corridors again after today. She did not know how Tristan knew that she needed to hear it, but he had known, and he had said it. "Thank you," she said quietly. He walked away across the courtyard. Brennan fell into step beside him and said something close to his ear. Tristan's response was too low to hear, but Brennan laughed, a genuine, unguarded laugh, and clapped his cousin on the shoulder. Emma watched them disappear through the archway and stood in the cold courtyard for a moment longer than she needed to. Then she went back to work. Because bread did not wait, and floors did not sweep themselves, and the world of Dawnhollow Castle moved forward, regardless of what occurred in doorways or courtyards, or the quiet space between one person saying something true and another person deciding whether to believe it. But that evening, when Sina sat beside her near the kitchen fire and asked without preamble whether anything worth telling had happened that day, Emma found that the answer required more words than she had expected. And when she finished speaking, Sina was quiet for a long moment. "He asked who you were," Sina repeated. "Yes." "Not what you were." "No." Sina looked into the fire. Then she said, with the careful precision of someone who means to be accurate rather than kind, "Emma, that man is going to be a problem for you." Emma looked at the strip of linen still wrapped around her right hand. "I know," she said. What she did not say, what she barely allowed herself to think, was that for the first time in 2 winters, the word problem did not feel entirely like a warning. It felt, in the most cautious and reluctant way possible, like the beginning of something she did not yet have a name for. She folded that thought away carefully, the way she had folded the blue ribbon, and went to sleep. 3 days later, a servant arrived at the kitchen door with a message. Not a letter. Emma could not read well enough for letters, and whoever had sent this had known that. It was a small object wrapped in cloth, a sprig of dried thyme, tied with a length of dark ribbon, and beneath it a single line drawn in careful block letters, large enough for someone with limited reading to parse without difficulty. The herb garden is better than the hall. Tessina read it over Emma's shoulder, said absolutely nothing, and went back to stirring the pot with the expression of someone exercising enormous restraint. Emma held the sprig of thyme in her palm for a long moment. Then she tucked it into her apron pocket and went back to work, and did not let herself smile until she was certain no one was looking. She was not entirely successful. The thyme sprig sat in a small clay cup on the windowsill above Emma's cot, dried and quiet, for 11 days before Tristan came back to Dawn Hollow. She had not expected him to return at all. That was what she told herself during those 11 days, with the same firm practicality she applied to everything else. The bread, the floors, the water hauling, the quiet mechanical rhythm of a life built entirely from useful tasks. He was the heir to the Lycan king. He had border disputes to manage, and treaty signatures to provide, and an entire kingdom of obligations that had nothing to do with a servant Omega in a castle kitchen. The time had been a kind gesture, a moment of warmth from a man who was, by all evidence, more thoughtful than his station required him to be. It did not need to mean anything beyond itself. She almost believed that by the 4th day. By the 11th day, she had stopped trying. He arrived on horseback in the early afternoon, with Brennan and Cade and 4 of his father's guardsmen, and Emma learned of it the way she learned most things, through Sina, who had learned it from the stable boy, who had seen the horses come through the east gate with the royal standard flying. Emma absorbed this information while straining a pot of broth and did not visibly react, which Sina acknowledged with the small approving nod she reserved for genuine self-control. He found her in the herb garden before supper. She was on her knees in the dirt, which was not the dignified position she might have chosen for a reunion. But the winter rosemary was struggling and it needed attention more than she needed composure. She heard his boots on the garden path and knew before she looked up that it was him. There was something about the weight of his step, the particular rhythm of it, that she had apparently memorized without intending to. "You got the time," he said. "I got the time," she confirmed, sitting back on her heels and looking up at him. He was in traveling clothes today rather than the full leather armor. A dark tunic, a heavy wool cloak, boots still carrying the dust of the road. He looked, if anything, more tired than the last time she had seen him. But he was looking at her with that same quality of attention that she had spent 11 days trying to find a category for and had ultimately given up on. "The rosemary is sulking," he said, crouching down to look at the plant with apparent genuine interest. "It does not like the cold," Emma said. "It needs the roots covered before the first frost, or it won't survive the winter. Do you have enough straw for that? I will find some." He reached out and pressed 2 fingers lightly into the soil around the base of the plant, testing its moisture, with the ease of someone who had done this before. Emma watched him, surprised. "You know herbs," she said. "My mother kept a garden," he said. She believed that a man who could not grow something had a limited understanding of patience. He stood, brushing the earth from his fingers. She was usually right about things like that. "Was?" Emma asked carefully. "She died when I was 17, he said. It was stated simply, without the performance of grief, the way old losses sometimes settled into the body and became simply part of the landscape. She would have liked this garden. Emma stood, brushing her own hands against her apron. They were standing close enough that she was aware of the warmth coming off him in the cool afternoon air, and of his scent. Leather and dark forest, and something underneath that she had no clean word for, but recognized now the way you recognize a voice you have only heard once. "Why did you come back?" she asked. "I told my father I needed to review the Dawn Hollow garrison records," he said. "And do you?" A pause, just long enough to be an answer in itself. "The garrison records are perfectly adequate," he said. "I reviewed them in under an hour." Emma looked at him. "Tristan," she said. "What are you doing?" He met her eyes directly, the way she had noticed he always did. No deflection, no performance. Just the steady blue gaze that seemed constitutionally incapable of looking somewhere easier. "I am trying to understand something," he said. "Your scent. It has been—" He stopped, chose his words with evident care. "It has been present, since the night of the gathering, in a way that does not resolve." Emma was quiet. She understood what he was describing, in the abstract. She had heard of it, the way certain scents caught in the memory of a wolf and would not release. She had simply never considered that it could work in her direction, that anything about her could hold in someone's memory that way. "I am an Omega," she said, not defensively. As a fact, she was simply laying on the table between them. "I know what you are," he said. "Your father is the Lycan King," she said. "I am a kitchen servant. I want to make certain we are both looking at those two things clearly." "I am looking at them," he said. "I have been looking at nothing else for 11 days. He paused. "And I am still here." The herb garden was quiet around them. Somewhere beyond the castle walls, a wind moved through the pine forest that bordered Dawn Hollow's eastern edge, carrying the smell of cold earth and resin. Emma looked at the man in front of her. The road dust on his cloak, the tiredness around his eyes, the scar along his jaw, the steady and uncomplicated way he told the truth, and felt something shift in her chest. Not the fragile, hopeful thing that Gareth's promise had been. Something quieter and more solid, and therefore considerably more frightening. "You should know something," she said. "Tell me." "I am not good at this," she said. "At trusting things that are offered. I have had some evidence recently that my judgment in that area is not reliable." "Your judgment was not the problem," Tristan said, with a quiet certainty that made her look at him sharply. "A man who makes a promise in a garden and breaks it in a hall is the problem. Those are not the same thing." Before she could respond, the sound of rapid footsteps on the garden path made them both turn. It was Cade, moving with a purposeful speed that immediately told Tristan something was wrong. Emma had learned enough about Cade in 3 encounters to know that he did not hurry without reason. "There is a situation," Cade said to Tristan. "Lord Fenwick's son arrived an hour ago. He is in the Great Hall, and he is not alone, and he is asking for the Omega who embarrassed his ally at the gathering." Emma went still. "Embarrassed?" she repeated. "That is the word he used," Cade said, with the flat tone of someone quoting something they personally found objectionable. Tristan turned to look at Emma. Something had changed in his expression. Not anger, exactly, but a settling. The kind of settling that happens when a decision that has been forming for days finally finds its shape. "You did not embarrass anyone," he said. "You walked across a hall and spoke a man's name." He looked at Cade. "Who came with Fenwick's son?" 6 men, armed." "On what grounds does he enter Dawn Hollow with 6 armed men to make demands about a castle servant?" "He claims she made a scene at the gathering that reflected poorly on the Ashvale Pack's honor, and that Lord Edric has requested she be formally censured." The word censured landed in the garden like a stone dropping into still water. Emma understood what it meant in practical terms. Removal from the castle, loss of her position, possibly worse depending on how far Lord Edric wanted to push it. She had done nothing wrong. That was the particular cruelty of it. She had crossed a room, said a name, and been publicly humiliated, and now the humiliation was being reframed as her offense. She squared her shoulders. "I will go and speak with him myself," she said. "You will not go alone," Tristan said. "I am not your responsibility," Emma said. Not unkindly, but firmly. "I have managed my own difficulties for a long time." "I know you have," he said. "You are exceptional at it." He held her gaze. "But you do not have to manage this one alone. That is not charity. It is a choice I am making, and it is mine to make." She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the rosemary at their feet. Then she gave a single, small nod. They walked into the great hall together. Emma, Tristan, Cade, and Brennan, who had materialized from somewhere with the uncanny timing he always managed in situations that might become interesting. The hall had been set back to its everyday arrangement, long tables and plain candles. And at the far end stood a young man of perhaps 25 with the Fenwick pack colors on his cloak, and 6 armed men arranged behind him with the ostentatious positioning of people who wanted to appear more threatening than the situation strictly required. He looked at Emma first, then at Tristan, and the color shifted in his face through several stages in quick succession. "Your Highness," he said, with a bow that was technically correct and entirely graceless. "I did not know you were in residence." "I arrived this afternoon," Tristan said pleasantly. "I understand you have concerns about one of Dawnhollow's servants. Lord Edric of Ashvale has made a formal complaint regarding—" "Lord Edric of Ashvale," Tristan said, with the same pleasant tone, "made a choice at this gathering that was entirely within his rights." The servant in question made no scene. She spoke to a man who had made her a promise, was informed the promise would not be honored, and left the hall. He let a pause sit for exactly the right amount of time. "I was present. I saw all of it." The young man's mouth opened, closed. "Furthermore," Tristan continued, and now the pleasantness had something underneath it, something that had no warmth in it at all. "This woman stands under my personal recognition. If Lord Edric has further concerns about her conduct, he may bring them to my father's court in writing, and they will be addressed there." He tilted his head slightly. "Is that understood?" The 6 armed men behind Fenwick's son had gone very quiet. "Understood, Your Highness," the young man said. "Good." Tristan glanced toward the door with the polite finality of a man who considers a matter closed. "I expect you will want to be on the road before dark." They were gone within the hour. Emma stood in the emptied hall afterward, the silence settling around the stone columns, and looked at the floor for a long moment while she put herself back together from the inside out. Then she looked up at Tristan, who was watching her with that steady, unhurried attention she had come to recognize as simply the way he occupied space. "You called me," she said. "This woman stands under my personal recognition. You said that." "I did," he said. "That is not a small thing to say," Emma said. "In this kingdom, about an Omega servant." "No," he agreed. "It is not." She looked at him. He looked at her. The candles in the iron holders burned between them, small and steady. "Why?" she asked. The same question she kept asking, because she kept needing to understand, and he kept giving her answers that required time to settle. "Because it is true," he said simply. "And because I decided, 11 days ago in a courtyard, that I was done watching people overlook you and calling it the natural order of things." Brennan, from a tactful distance near the far column, studied the ceiling with great apparent interest. Emma pressed her wrapped hand briefly against her side, feeling the edge of the linen bandage still there, worn thin now from days of kitchen work. Then she looked up at Tristan and made a decision of her own. "The rosemary," she said. "I will need help gathering the straw to cover it before the frost comes." The storeroom is on the far side of the east courtyard and the basket is heavy. A pause. I have no pressing obligations this evening, Tristan said. No garrison records to review? I believe I mentioned those were adequately settled. Then, Emma said, and this time she did not press the almost smile down. I suppose you are available. The frost came 3 nights later. Emma woke to it before dawn. The particular stillness in the air that meant the temperature had dropped past the point of warning into something final. She dressed quickly and went to the herb garden before the kitchen fires were even lit, half expecting to find the rosemary blackened and lost. Instead, she found it tucked under a careful mound of straw, the roots protected, exactly as she and Tristan had arranged it 2 evenings before. She stood in the frozen garden for a long moment, her breath making small clouds in the dark air, and felt something move through her chest that she did not try to name or manage or fold away into a pocket. She simply let it be there. The following morning, a summons arrived for her. Not the threatening kind, not Lord Edric's reframed cruelty dressed in formal language. This was a message from the castle steward, delivered with an expression that suggested he found the situation personally confusing, informing her that Prince Tristan had requested her presence in the castle's upper library at the 2nd hour after midday. Sina read it over her shoulder, set it down on the kitchen table, and said, "Go. I will cover your afternoon duties. Sina. Emma." Sina looked at her with the clear-eyed precision she always deployed when she wanted to be certain she was heard. "You spent 2 winters carrying a promise made by a man who was never going to keep it. You have spent the last 2 weeks being seen, genuinely seen, by someone who has given you no reason to doubt him. Go." Emma went. The upper library of Dawnhollow Castle was a long room on the castle's 3rd level, lined floor to ceiling with shelves of bound manuscripts and rolled maps, smelling of old parchment and candle wax, and the particular dusty warmth of a room that holds a great deal of accumulated knowledge and no pretension about it. Tristan was standing at the large table in the center when she arrived. Several maps spread open before him, and a candle burning at each corner to hold them flat. He looked up when she entered, and the expression on his face was the one she had come to trust most. Uncomplicated, direct, and entirely without performance. "Come and look at this," he said by way of greeting. She crossed to the table. The maps showed the northern pack territories, the borders, the forests, the rivers that divided one claim from another. He had been making notes in the margins in a small, precise hand. "The Split Rock Pack has been encroaching on the eastern woodland for 2 seasons, he said. "The families who forage there are being pushed out. Most of them are Omegas, families without standing to file formal complaints with my father's court." He paused. "I am trying to build a case that does not require them to have standing. That establishes the territory violation on its own terms." Emma looked at the maps, at the careful notations in the margins, at the evidence of a man who had spent considerable private time on a problem that benefited people who could offer him nothing in return. "You do this often," she said. It was not a question. "When I can," he said. "Does your father know?" "My father knows I manage border concerns," Tristan said, with a careful neutrality that told her the full answer was more complicated than that. She looked at him across the table. "You are not what people think you are," she said. "What do people think I am?" She considered being diplomatic, decided against it. "The servants here call you the prince who makes maids cry," she said. "Before I met you, I believed it." Something moved across his expression. Not quite pain, but close to it. He was quiet for a moment. "There was a time when that was closer to true than I would like," he said finally, not cruelty for its own sake. "But I was younger and I was careless, and carelessness in someone with power is its own form of cruelty. I dismissed people without thinking about the weight of being dismissed. I said things without considering what it meant to be on the receiving end of them." He met her eyes, I am not proud of it." "What changed?" Emma asked. "I watched my father make a decision that destroyed a family," he said. "A good family. An Omega family who had served the crown for 3 generations. He dismissed them over a political convenience and did not think about them again afterward. And I realized I was becoming someone who would do the same thing without noticing." A pause. I decided I did not want to be that person. Emma absorbed this. The candles burned steadily at the corners of the maps. Outside the library window, the frost-pale sky was beginning to soften toward afternoon. "I need to tell you something," she said. "Tell me." "When I walked into you at the gathering," she said, "I was not looking where I was going, because I was trying very hard not to fall apart in front of 40 people who would have been satisfied to see it. And the reason I did not fall apart was not strength, it was stubbornness. There is a difference." "I know there is," Tristan said. "I am telling you because I think you see something in me that is perhaps more composed than I actually am," she said. "And I would rather you knew that now than discover it later and feel misled." Tristan looked at her steadily from across the map table. "Emma," he said. "Stubbornness that holds when everything is pulling the other direction is exactly what strength looks like. Those are the same thing." She held his gaze. He did not look away. "I would like to ask you something," he said. "And I want you to answer honestly, without calculating what the answer is supposed to be." "All right." "Will you stay at Dawn Hollow?" he said. "Not as a kitchen servant. I spoke to the castle steward this morning. There is a position in the household records that needs someone with attention to detail and enough practical knowledge of the castle to keep the accounts accurately. It is a legitimate post. It has nothing to do with me, officially." He paused. "But unofficially, I would like you to be somewhere I can find you when I ride in from the border, if that is something you want." The room was very quiet. Emma looked at the maps on the table, at the careful notes in the margins, at the burned-down candles and the frost on the window glass, and the sprig of thyme he had sent 11 days ago that was still sitting in a clay cup above her cot. She thought about 2 winters of carrying a promise that had always been intended to cost her something. She thought about what it felt like to be asked who rather than what. "Yes," she said, simply and without qualification. Something in Tristan's expression settled, deeply and finally, the way a thing settles when it has found the place it was always meant to rest. What followed was not sudden. It did not need to be. Over the weeks that came after, as the frost deepened into true winter and the castle settled into its cold season rhythms, Emma moved into the household records position and discovered that she was, in fact, exceptionally good at it. The accounts had been kept carelessly for years, and she spent the first fortnight untangling errors that had been compounding quietly for 2 full seasons. The steward, who had expected to supervise her closely, found within a week that she required no supervision at all, and told her so with the slightly surprised expression of a man updating a long-held assumption. Tristan came to Dawn Hollow when his duties permitted, which was not always often, but was always deliberate. He brought her books with the text read aloud in the evenings when he stayed, patient and unhurried, until she had learned enough letters to manage the passages herself. He consulted her on the Split Rock border case, which she helped him organize into a formal presentation for the king's court. He argued the case before Lycan King Aldrich in the 3rd month of winter and won it. The eastern woodland restored to the Omega families who had foraged there for generations, the encroachment formally recorded as a violation of crown law. Sina was promoted to head of the kitchen stores, a position she accepted with the air of someone who had been running things informally for years, and was mildly relieved the title had caught up with reality. Brennan visited twice, and was, on both occasions, entirely too pleased with himself about how events had unfolded, a fact that Tristan bore with the patient resignation of a man who had spent his whole life being Brennan's cousin. Cade said very little about any of it, which from Cade was the equivalent of a lengthy speech of approval. Gareth of Ashvale passed through Dawn Hollow once in the deep winter, on his way north with Isolde and her family. Emma saw him crossing the inner courtyard from the window of the records room. He looked up at the castle's upper floors as he passed, perhaps by accident, perhaps not. And for a single moment she wondered if he saw her there, at the window, with the account ledgers open on the table behind her and the dried thyme sprig on the sill beside the glass. She did not move away from the window. She did not hide. She simply watched him ride on and felt nothing that required recovery. On the first day of spring, when the frost finally released the herb garden and the rosemary came back green and strong from under its protective straw, Tristan stood with Emma in the garden in the early morning light. He had ridden in the night before from the eastern border. She had heard his horse in the courtyard and had not gone down, had waited until morning, because some things were worth waiting for properly. He stood beside her now, looking at the rosemary. "It held," he said. "It held." She agreed. He reached out and took her hand, the one that had been cut the night of the gathering, long-healed now, the small scar barely visible. He held it with the same straightforward, unperformative honesty that he brought to everything. "I would like to make you a promise," he said, "in a garden, since it seems to be where the important things happen for you." Emma looked up at him. The spring light was pale and clear and very clean. "I am listening," she said. "I promise," he said, "that every word I give you will be one I intend to keep. Not because it is required of me, because you are the person I want to be honest with." He paused. "That is the whole promise. It does not require a ceremony or a declaration in a hall, but I wanted you to hear it said plainly." Emma looked at his face, at the scar and the blue eyes and the road-weathered honesty of him. "I believe you," she said, and meant it without reservation, which was the most extraordinary thing, and also the simplest. She did not need a hall full of witnesses. She did not need a declaration before 40 pairs of eyes. She had something considerably rarer. A man who had sought her out in a garden in the cold, covered her rosemary against the frost, asked who she was instead of what she was, and kept every word he had spoken since. She kept his hand in hers as the spring morning opened around them, and the herb garden smelled of thyme and cold earth and something new beginning. And that was enough. That was more than enough. It was everything.